Now we're on to the second part of our unit, which is multiplying and dividing fractions. So today we're going to start with multiplying fractions and mixed numbers. And multiplying fractions is kind of like multiplying integers. It's got a completely different set of rules from what we learned with adding and subtracting, which lead us kind of into our essential question: how do I combine my multiplying fraction rules with things like cross-simplifying, that kind of stuff, with my integer multiplication rules where I'm trying to decide whether my answer is going to be positive or negative. So get these pieces of information into your notes. These are our steps for multiplying fractions, our quick review. One is use your integer rules to decide if the answer is going to be positive or negative. So if you remember, if I multiply a positive times a negative, my answer stays negative. Even if the first number is the negative, if I got a negative times a positive, it's still going to stay negative. So if one of them is negative, it stays negative. But if I do a negative times a negative, that's where they cancel each other out and go back to being a positive. But get that written down. Then we're going to look to cross-simplify. So if you remember, cross-simplifying is where we divide something out of the numerator and denominator in the problem, but we do it before we've actually done the multiplying of the fractions. Then you multiply numerators and multiply denominators. So you're just multiplying straight across, and then always check to see if you can simplify your answer when you're done. So let's do these three together. So anytime I see a negative out in front of my fraction, I'm really going to rewrite it with my numerator. That way I always know where that negative is. It never gets lost. Yes, the whole fraction is negative, but you just put it with one part of the fraction in order to make sure that sign makes it all the way through the problem. When you're multiplying times a whole number, remember you can just write a whole number over 1 to turn it into a fraction. So this really becomes negative 3/8 times 12 over 1. And then here's where you look for the cross-simplifying. Oh, I take it back. Before we do anything else, let's figure out the sign of our answer. So I have a negative times a positive. When one's negative, one's positive, we know our answer is going to be negative. Now we don't have to worry about whether it's positive or negative anymore. Now we just worry about the fractions themselves. So I like to think of it as just one giant fraction. And I like to think about, is there something in a numerator and denominator I could divide by the same thing? In this case, 8 and 12 can each be divided by 4. So as long as I do the same thing to a numerator and denominator, I'm good. 8 divided by 4 is 2. 12 divided by 4 is 3. Resist the temptation to cancel or divide out the 3's. You can't do it if they're both in the numerator together. It's got to be one numerator, one denominator. So in this case, I've simplified as much as I can. So I do 3 times 3 is 9. 2 times 1 is 2. Just numerator times numerator, denominator times denominator. When I get done, I'll notice that this is an improper fraction. My numerator is bigger than my denominator, so I change it into a mixed number. 2 goes into 9 4 times with 1 left over, so 4 1/2, and the negative just sticks with it. So it's not the whole number is negative or the fraction part, the whole thing is negative. Next one, 7/12 times negative 8/28. So again, I always kind of think of the negative with my numerator. I've got a positive times a negative, so I know my answer is going to be negative. And now I try to simplify. So in this case, 7 and 28 can each be divided by 7. So that gives me a 4 and a 1. 8 and 12 can each be divided by 4, similar to that last problem. So I get a 3 and a 2. And in this case, I don't care about that negative anymore. I've already put it into my answer, so I'm good. Here I can do just a little bit more simplifying. My 2 and 4 could be divided a second time by 2. So you can always go back and do some more simplifying if it's there. And then when I'm done, I'm going to multiply. 1 times 1 is 1. 3 times 2 is 6. So I get an answer of negative 1/6. All right, last one here. Negative 8/9 times 4/7 times negative 21/24. So first let's get the sign of our answer out of the way. A negative times a positive stays negative, but then times another negative, so I've got two negatives in the problem, they're going to cancel each other out, and we're going to go back to being a positive for a final answer. Now I just look to cross simplify. Here I can see 8 and 24 could each be divided by 8. So that gives me a 1 and a 3. 7 and 21 can be divided by 7. Not every problem is going to have something you could divide out, but always look to see what you can find. Here, my 9 and my 3 can be divided again. I can divide by 3. Somebody else might have done the 3 and the 3. That's fine. It'll all work out to be the same answer when we're done. My 4 up here, I can't divide with anything else, so it's going to stay there. And I've got a couple of 3's down here. But when I'm done, I just multiply. 1 times 4 times 1 is 4. 3 times 1 times 3 is 9. So I get an answer of 4/9. So it's really just a fraction multiplication problem. And now we just throw in that sign with our integer rules. For mixed numbers, you need to change them into improper fractions first. We can't multiply them with mixed numbers. It gets really ugly, it gets really complicated. It's not something we want to tackle. So the easier solution is change them to improper fractions and then just multiply them. So we do 4 times 6 is 24, plus 1 is 25/6. 3 times 5 is 15, plus 3 is 18/5. Notice I didn't think of this as a negative 3 times a 5. This whole fraction turns into 18/5. The negative just sticks with it. The whole fraction was negative, so the whole improper fraction is negative. Ignore that sign until after you've changed it into an improper fraction. Now I'm ready to multiply. So first I tackle my sign. A positive times a negative means my answer is going to stay negative. 25 and 5 could both be divided by 5. So I get a 1 and a 5. 6 and 18 can each be divided by 6. So I get a 3 and a 1. And notice, as I'm cross-simplifying, I could care less about the signs of anything because I've already dealt with the sign. I'm purely working with my numbers here. 5 times 3 is 15. 1 times 1 is 1. And anything over 1 is really just that number. So in this case, negative 15. Let's try next one here. Negative 1 7/8 times negative 2 2/5. So changing the improper fractions. 1 times 8 is 8. Plus 7 is 15/8. And the negative hangs out. 2 times 5 is 10. Plus 2 is 12/5. And again, the negative hangs out. Now we look to decide our sign. A negative times a negative. So a negative times a negative means my answer is going to be positive. They cancel each other out. 15 and 5 can each be divided by 5. So I get a 1 and a 3. 8 and 12 can each be divided by 4. We've seen that one come up quite a bit. And then we multiply. 3 times 3 is 9. 2 times 1 is 2. Always check at the end, could I simplify anymore? In this case I can't, but it is an improper fraction. So 2 goes into 9 4 times with 1 left over. So I get an answer of positive 4 1/2. So it's really just deciding your sign based on your integer rules, and then you treat it like a regular division problem or multiplication problem. Now we got a word problem here. The reason we threw in a word problem here is because you've got to be able to set up the problem and realize what it is you're trying to find in this problem. So this one says the height of an object on Mars is about 2/5 its weight on Earth. So you've probably heard that, the astronauts kind of bounce and that kind of stuff when they're on the moon. It's similar on Mars. They're not nearly as heavy. There's not as much gravity pulling them down. So we want to know how much would an 80.5-pound dog weigh on Mars? Well, its weight is about 2/5 of what it is on Mars. So that word of is a kind of a key. We want 2/5 of 80.5. That word of is really code for multiply. When you want a fraction of something, it really just means multiply times that fraction. So I want 2/5 times, in this case, 2 times 80 is 160, plus 1 is 161 halves. Now I'm going to cross simplify. In this case, there's not a whole lot I can do. I can divide those each by 2's. So I get 161 over 5. Now, you might be able to do some mental math here, but whenever you're trying to turn an improper fraction into a mixed number, a division problem really will work just fine. 161 divided by 5. 5 goes into 16 3 times, which is 15. Subtract 1 and bring down another one. 2 goes into 11 2 times, which is 10. That leftover remainder, that's your fraction. and the denominator, what you were dividing by, stays the same. So an 80.5 pound dog on Earth would weigh 32 1/5 pounds on Mars. But that word of was kind of my key there. It told me that I wanted to multiply.